We've been talking about worldviews, and I've tried to explain what a worldview is. A lot of people don't think they have one, but everybody does. A worldview is kind of like a grid through which you see everything and through which you interpret everything. It has to do with presuppositions that you have, and maybe you don't even recognize those presuppositions. But everybody has a worldview, and in the last couple sessions I've focused in on one that is more attuned to me, which is the Christian worldview. We could call it the Judeo-Christian, the biblical worldview, whatever word you want to use. And we talked about some of the principles that kind of flow out of that particular worldview. Today, in this session, I want to go a little astray from that, although there will be connections that will be made, and talk about the Greco-Roman worldview. Now, this is going to coincide with both the Old Testament and New Testament times. The Greeks started things off with a certain culture and a certain different philosophies that they promoted, and the Romans picked up on this quite a bit. And so that's why we can talk about Greco-Roman. What we're going to see really is that the Romans quite often did a lot of borrowing from the Greeks. But the Greeks and the Romans both had a basic understanding of the world that kind of coincided. Now, what we see, if we go to the New Testament, this is where I say there's this cross-pollination taking place here. If you go to the Apostle Paul, for instance, who's going out on his missionary journeys, what Paul has to do is he has to deal with the worldview, the culture that is out there, and the different philosophies that were there in the Greco-Roman culture of his day. In particular, when Paul is on one of his journeys and he goes to Athens, and Athens is considered to be like the intellectual center of the Greek world, what he discovers is there's a lot of people there who want to talk about all kinds of different philosophies. And if you go to Acts chapter 17, the book of Acts in the New Testament, and read through Paul's experience with these different philosophers, here's what we see. We say, while Paul was waiting for them, his other friends who were on the missionary journey with him, while he was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Now, these are things you've probably heard of, Epicureans, Stoics, who are they, what are they? I'll come back to that in a little later time, but the main point now is that they exist there in Athens. Paul is aware of them, and Paul wants to speak to their worldview, and he wants to bring the gospel message into that. And it says, some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Referring to Paul, of course. Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears. We want to know what they mean. So at least there was an interest there. What Paul was presenting to them sounded really different than what they were used to. So, please explain to us what this is all about. Now, little side comment that Luke makes here in the book of Acts is that all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Now, it doesn't mean they would act on ideas, that he just kind of fascinated with different ideas. Now, Paul goes straight to the heart of things. He said, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, when Paul gets to the end of his message and talks about Jesus' resurrection, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So we've got people who do respond to it. Sometimes I've heard some Christians say, Paul really got off the beam here because he started dealing with philosophy and talking with people about different philosophies. And look, what happened to them? Well, they sneered and all that kind of thing. But if you read the passage carefully, you discover that really what happens here is that a church begins because of what Paul has said. Now, the whole Greco-Roman culture had certain Greek and Roman gods. One thing we need to be very clear about here is many people did believe literally in the Greek gods, the Roman gods, but a lot of people just kind of gave lip service to them, and so there was kind of a hunger and opening in this society for something, shall we say, a little more genuine, a little more real for their lives. But the Greek and Roman gods, they've been around forever. And in fact, the Romans basically took the same gods the Greeks had and gave them different names. So if we look at a chart, for instance, of the various gods that existed during this time, if you go to the second to the left there, the one called Zeus, that underneath are all the Greek names, and on top are the Roman names for the same gods. Zeus then becomes Jupiter. You see that Poseidon, the god of the sea in Greece, becomes Neptune in Rome. And various others follow the same pattern, where Ares, the god of war, in Greece becomes Mars in Rome. So the various gods that exist during this time period are really just copies during the Roman time of what the Greeks actually offered. And so there's not a whole lot of what we might call depth to this. Now, these pagan societies, among the Christians, there's always this debate that has gone on ever since the first century. How much of the pagan belief system, how much of the pagan worldview is acceptable? Is there any way to make these two things coincide in any way? And there have been big debates and big arguments over that. I'd like to go to a comment made by David Downing, who's a C.S. Lewis scholar, and of course C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and in Downing's book about Narnia, he deals with this whole issue of the pagan and the Christian, and I think it's a very significant thing to insert at this point. He says, Lewis believed that pagans and early Christians had far more in common than either shares with modern thinkers. In common usage, pagan and Christian are practically contraries, because the first represents a secular, this world attitude, and the second represents its opposite. And that's the way most people will definitely think about this. C.S. Lewis, though, had a little different perspective on it. He said Lewis saw no such antithesis, opposite like that. He called paganism, quote, the childhood of religion, a prophetic dream. So for him, paganism was kind of an anticipation of what was to come later. Christianity became the fulfillment of that. Downing goes on to say, some readers who have heard the Chronicles described as Christian fantasy are then surprised to find the world of Narnia peopled with things like fauns and satyrs and tree nymphs and even specific Roman gods such as Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, Pomona, goddess of orchards. But Lewis believed that the noblest classical myths represented, again, quote here, a real though unfocused gleam of divine truth falling on human imagination. So it's kind of like a precursor. And for Lewis, people who believed in the pagan things were at least more open to the supernatural, to the message, than people who might have just dismissed it entirely. So maybe there was more of a connection. As one person who wrote a book about Lewis, and David Colbert, and he called this the magical worlds of Narnia, said this. He said, Lewis believed fairy tales and religion were naturally connected. He saw myths and legends, like the things we were talking about with Greece and Rome, as a step in humankind's development of belief. To him, they were part of a logical path to Christianity. And the interesting comment he made there, he said, Lewis didn't mind that the path through paganism was muddy. In other words, it's not a clear path, but nevertheless, it is a path. Right? Now, this goes back to something I talked about toward the beginning, as we look at the way that the Greeks and the Romans during this time period kind of believed how history played out. And we call this a cyclical view of history. It's decay from a golden age, leading to a monarchy, leading back to an oligarchy ruled by just a few, and then eventually getting it back to a democracy, which then goes through that same cycle again. And that's the problem during this time period with their understanding of culture and how things work out in society. The cyclical worldview led to a genuine pessimism. Pessimism about the future. What really is going to happen? It's just going to be the same old thing going over and over again. Right? Well, so they try to find meaning. So therefore, what do in Greece? They say, well, let's focus on, us, really. How about the Greek city-states that were set up? And of course, if you know about Greek history, every one of the cities everybody was really tied to the city, whether it was Athens or Corinth or Sparta or whatever. So the Greek city-states kind of became the center of their life. Well, one Christian philosopher who I mentioned before, Francis Schaeffer, had this to say about this particular prospect of the city-state being what it ought to be. He said, look, the Greeks tried first to build their society upon the city-state, that is the polis. The city-state, both in theory and fact, was comprised of all those who were accepted as citizens, and all values had meaning in reference to the polis. In other words, your existence really had value only within your city. And that's why many times in Greek cities, if somebody runs afoul of the populace and the government there, they get ostracized, they get kicked out for a number of years. That's considered like the worst possible thing that could happen to you, to be separated from your city. He says, thus when Socrates had to choose between death and exile from that which gave him meaning, he chose death. That was an easier path than being ostracized from his city. But the polis failed, since it proved to be an insufficient base upon which to build a society. Well, here we look at these people right here, and we see, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. These are considered the great thinkers of ancient Greece. But because they did reject the gods, though, and so they turned to philosophy, they turned to other things. And so with them, what we have here comes the idea that ideas are the ultimate reality. And only eternal, unchanging ideas are really important. Therefore, they're not all that focused on what's happening in the world itself. I mean, this is definitely a worldview, okay? The external world, which is constantly changing, they would say, is not ultimately significant. Now, Aristotle deviated from this somewhat, and he was more interested in particulars, but we're still talking about the same vein of things here. And therefore, things like history, which of course is very, very much part of me, was relegated to a lesser role in Greek society, below both philosophy and poetry. Philosophy was the height of things. Poetry may be a way to explain it. History is just a cyclical thing. It just happens over and over the same old way. Well, what we see here is that we've got a guy by the name of Plato that we already mentioned, who becomes the first Western philosopher to apply philosophy to politics. His ideas on, for example, the nature and value of justice, the relationship between justice and politics, those have been extraordinarily influential throughout the ages. Plato wrote a book that is called the Republic. It was written after the Peloponnesian Wars, and it reflected Plato's perception of politics as a dirty business that sought mainly to manipulate the unthinking masses, and it failed to nurture wisdom. Now, I can imagine there are a lot of us today who might agree with Plato on that particular point, at least. But then it comes to his, what you might call his solution to the problem, which may not really be a good solution at all. He said, what should happen here is society should be divided into three classes. The first class are the workers. They're the people who do the common labor. They are necessary just to maintain the nuts and bolts of how a society operates. Secondly, there are the soldiers. They're the ones who protect society from external enemies. They're the ones who keep the peace. But beyond that, those are kind of like the common people. Okay? But there's another class of people. Remember, the three classes here. This is the one that Plato really wants to focus on. And these are people that he calls the guardians. They're going to be the guardians of society. And how does this work? Well, first of all, he says we got to create this guardian group of people out of what you might call the best of the human stock. Now, of course, I have quotation marks personally around stock because that kind of makes me feel like we're talking about people like animals. But Plato has the concept here that what you need to do is eliminate the family unit. And, when children are born to whomever, because it doesn't matter if you're husband and wife, state nurseries are set up. He says, look, the human stock, the best of the human stock are the ones who ought to have the kids, who are going to then be trained to become the next leaders. And in this society, this group is going to be just going to operate on pure communism. Nobody owns anything. The state is really everything, and they live for the state. And ultimately, they're going to be trained to be philosopher kings. At least that's the intent that Plato had. Now, his Republic was just simply a thought thing. It never really came into being. At one point, he did try to train up a young man who was going to take over leadership in one of the countries, and the guy just totally, actually at one point tried to kill Plato, his teacher. Apparently, his philosophy didn't actually come to fruition and didn't work out the way that he intended for it to work out. So I'd like to quote from this man here also, who's a Harvard historian named Richard Pipes, an excellent book on the history of communism, because I just mentioned that was part of what took place in Plato's Republic there. And Pipes says the idea of a classless, fully egalitarian society first emerged in classical Greece, okay, just like we were talking about. In the Republic, speaking through Socrates, Plato saw the root of discord and wars in belongings. Okay? Now here's what he said. Such differences commonly originate in a disagreement about the use of the terms mine and not mine, his and not his. And so for Plato, if you just get rid of the idea that people have things, then everything's going to turn out just fine. Okay? And Pipes does an excellent job of kind of debunking what Plato is saying here. And he goes on, in the Laws, something else Plato wrote, Plato envisioned not only a society in which people shared all worldly possessions, as well as their wives and children, but one in which the private and individual is altogether banished from life, and things which are by nature private have become common. And all men express praise and blame, feel joy and sorrow on the same occasion. Now, some of you might be thinking ahead to a guy named Karl Marx and a few other people with communism later, but we will come back to that. What's interesting to note is that some of these ideas are making the rounds even in ancient Greece. Okay? Now, there are other philosophies during this time period, and now is where we get back to the Apostle Paul in Athens, because it's said in that passage that he debated with the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. So what is Epicureanism? There's Epicurus right there, and everything consists in atoms in motion would be the first concept here, which really, if you kind of boil it all down, means pure materialism. There is no soul, there is nothing, it's just whatever you see, that's what is. Right? And then what you need to do, you need to withdraw from all public affairs. How about, get rid of, the ties of marriage, all family ties. In one sense, what we're talking about here is a philosophy that probably wants to just make life as easy as possible. And I think we can see that also in the kind of the formulation for Epicureanism, which is happiness equals a body free from pain and a mind free from worry. Well, who wouldn't want those? That's why it can be something that people, latch on to. Yeah, I want my body to be free from pain. I want to be free of all worries. If I get married, I have worries. If I have family, I have worries. If I get involved in public affairs, that's going to bring more worries. So Epicureanism did have a certain amount of appeal. But certain Epicureans just kind of say, we're just going a certain direction and we can do whatever we want to do. Now, of course, that still brings us back to something called Stoicism, which is where I'll pick up next time.